Well, hello again, and welcome back. In our lecture last week, we talked about the Spanish and the French involvement in the Western Hemisphere. And we didn't get into much detail, but one of the main points I wanted you to get out of that was that for both the Spanish and the French, the Indians were a very important part of the way they ran their empire. Without the Indians, they really wouldn't have been a Spanish or a French empire. They relied so heavily on the Indians, the Spanish for labor on the haciendas, the French as the people who went out and actually trapped the animals, and then they could trade for the furs. So the Spanish and the French empires rested on Indian labor, either agricultural labor or mining or hunting, trapping, whatever. But it depended on the Indians. And so the Indians became a key part of it, and both of those empires accepted Indians into their society. They accepted them as very low-level people. They had few rights, they had few privileges. They were definitely considered inferiors, but they were part of the system, and even to the extent that Spanish and French men legally married Indian women and those people became part of the community. So their communities evolved as to one extent or another, biracial communities. The Indians were always inferior, but they were part of the system. And I've done that because you can kind of anticipate where I'm going to go with the English. So today I want to talk about the English. And I think I already mentioned to you that the first English colony that lasted in what is now the United States was called Virginia. It was established in 1607. Now there were some earlier English colonies in what is the Americas that did not last, and there were some colonies of the English in the Caribbean, but our class doesn't cover those. We only cover the colony that established and survived. Now, the reason for establishing this, the reason why England finally decided to establish colonies, and you might think a little bit about the date. This is going to be 1607, and the Spanish have been around since the 1490s. So there was and they had conquered Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, in 1520. So this is almost 100 years after the Spanish had been there. So the English took a while before they finally got involved, and so the question is, why did they finally decide, after ignoring America for so long, finally did they decide to get involved? And I'm going to talk today about two main reasons why England finally decided to establish a colony in North America. One is going to be the least important one of the two. It's not the direct one, but it's sort of an underlying issue of English society as of just prior to 1607. For several decades, from the 1560s on, England had been facing a growing, what we might call, crisis. There was a serious problem that was troubling English leadership and English people. Today we would call it homelessness. There were just a lot of people in England that had no jobs, no place to go, no place to live, no way to survive except by whatever maybe illegal or quasi-legal ways they could do it. There's just mobs of people wandering around England that are just lost and a real threat to English society. And they don't really know what to do about it. I mean, they just don't understand this. Now, the reasons for this whole homelessness crisis are a little bit complex, but the problem was simply that the English population was growing at a time when demand for agricultural labor was decreasing. So between the fact that you've got the more and more people just living, because English society, the population is just increasing, some of the medical problems of the earlier centuries that had kept the population down, those medical problems have kind of gone away, and so the death rate is not as high, but that means that there's more people around, and at the same time, there's less and less of a demand for agricultural labor because of some changes in the agricultural systems. So it occurs to people that a solution to this problem would be to relocate the homeless people to America. Get them over there, have them do something, produce something, and get out of England, solve the homeless problem, and maybe become a source of who knows what from other activities in America. So that's one thing. There's this whole fear of homelessness and of mobs and riots and other problems within England caused by the abundance of population who are just wandering around the countryside, oftentimes in mobs. But the direct issue was established by a group of investors, English businessmen who'd had some wealth, and they formed, actually in 1606, a company called the Virginia Company. It was named Virginia after Queen Elizabeth, who had died a couple of years earlier. It was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. So this is the Virginia Company. And as a legal technicality, they got a charter from the king which enabled them to become a business, to become what was called a joint stock company. That would be the equivalent of a modern day corporation. It's basically the same thing, it's just a terminology. It's a joint stock company which has stockholders, investors, who put up money, and then the company is going to engage in some business activity and, like any company, earn a profit. So they recruited some people, mostly single men, usually people who were among the unemployed and the homeless people, pretty tough people, willing to take this on. You had to be pretty reckless to become an early settler of an English colony because there had been some earlier efforts at colonization that had failed and that everybody had died. So it's a pretty risky thing to do, and it's not for family men or people with some sort of responsibilities. It's for guys who are pretty tough, who are willing to take on the risks of going to America and getting involved in this first settlement. And then the company appointed a captain to be in charge, gave him the power to rule over the whole settlement. His name was John Smith. So they set out on 3 different boats in 1607 and arrived in America and established a settlement. It's a little complicated. They moved around a little bit, but they established a settlement at what they called Jamestown, and they named that after the current King of England, James I. So this is Jamestown, named after King James, in Virginia, named after Queen Elizabeth, his predecessor. So they're over there, and their job is to somehow make money for the company. And that's what it's all about. This is a business. And the Spanish, with their thoughts about finding gold and so forth, no, this is going to be a business. This is not, it's not run by the king. The Spanish Empire was run by the king. This is run by a private company involved in trying to make a profit. So, okay, now the question is, how were they going to make a profit? What were they going to do in America that would turn a profit? Well, this is kind of an interesting question. And if you ask some of the investors, the answer sort of would be, they might have given you some words, but the bottom line is, the answer is, I don't know. They were not clear on exactly what they're going to do in America that would become profitable. Uh, so, it strikes me as I look on this as an historian, I think, well, the guys who are investing in this company are not dummies. These are sharp guys, they're wealthy guys. They've made money by being very aggressive and successful businessmen. They're not always the most honest or the nicest people, but then a lot of times successful businessmen are not honest and nice. These are capable people, and they've got a record of successful businesses. Why would they invest in the Virginia company? And, I couldn't answer that for a lot of years, and then, it's been about, 20 years ago or so, when we had in the United States what was called the dot-com experience, when the internet first came into use, and there were all these companies set up on the internet, and they were all going to make money, but a lot of times they weren't clear on how they were going to do that. There was such an obsession with the internet that people in the 1990s invested in all kinds of companies, and what was the company going to do? Well, it's going to be on the internet. Yeah, but what's it going to do? Oh, it's going to be on the internet. Well, it's sort of similar back in 1607. What's the company do? Well, it's going to America. Yeah, but what's America? What are they going to do there to actually make money? Well, it's going to be America. It's just, they didn't know. There was such an obsession in England with America at that time. There was such an interest in it, and such a conviction that there was just great potential for wealth there. What people in England knew about America was that there was a lot of resources in America. There had been a number of English explorers who had sailed along the coast, observed situations on land, sometimes not landing themselves, sometimes getting off the boat and looking around. There was a guy named Richard Hakluyt, who is mentioned in the book, and I'll give you these names on a list. Richard Hakluyt had written about America, and he described all the resources that were there. And when people sailed along the coast of North America, and they looked around at it, they saw a lot of greenery. There's just a lot of trees and foliage and brush and stuff growing there. And what is it? We don't know. It's just green stuff, and it's just covers there. You can hardly see the land. There's animals all over the place. There's animals running all over the forests of North America. There's birds all around, and there's flocks of birds that would fly overhead, and there were so many of them they would almost like obscure the sun. I mean, there's just resources all over the place. And so somehow, out of those resources is a thought that we're going to make money. Exactly how, we don't know. What specifically are the resources? What particular plants are they? We don't know. There's just a lot of them, and there's just abundance there, and there's just lots of opportunities for wealth there. So investors who might have been pretty sensible guys in other ways, they just ate this stuff up. In fact, Richard Hakluyt, who was one of the big advocates of this whole, what you might call American frenzy, had himself not been to America. He talked to people who had, but he oftentimes embellished their stories. A lot of his accounts are exaggerated, and some of them are just flatly made up. I mean, he just flat made up stuff to go in his book. He wrote things about that are not true, but it all created this great interest in America. So these guys have flocked to the wealthy guys have flocked to the Virginia company, and they've put some money into it, and the company has used the money to send guys over to America, provide them with supplies to survive, and told them go out and make some money. Well, it turned out that, yeah, there's a lot of resources there, but none of them are necessarily in any demand. The idea that you could somehow produce stuff in America and bring it back to England and sell it for a profit, the way the French were selling furs at a profit, the idea that you could somehow do that with some of the trees or the vegetation or whatever animals might be around Virginia, there was nothing there that really worked. There's lots of abundance there, but it's not necessarily of any economic value. It's not a product that you can sell and make money on. It's just stuff that grows. A lot of the land of Virginia was very swampish, not easy to walk around in. And yeah, it grows a lot of stuff, but if you cut the stuff down, it doesn't mean that you can now then have some fertile agricultural fields. A lot of the soil is, it grows what's there, and something grows there, something is able to survive in the environment, but it's not really anything that you can use to produce an economic crop, something that you can use for a business. So in fact, the settlers had a hard time. The guys who came over struggled. A lot of them died. They died of starvation. They died of disease. Many of them decided that, excuse me, they were going to be the English Cortez. They were going to go out somehow, like Cortez did, and they're going to find some Indians, and they're going to find some glorious civilization like the Aztecs, and they're going to find gold, and they're going to find wealth, and then they're going to become really rich and everything like that. So they went wandering off into the forest and never were heard from again. John Smith was as mean as anything could be, but he had to be to keep the guys there and try to keep them working, try to get them to grow some stuff that they could survive on, that they could eat. And to do it, he was just as mean as could be. He would just beat guys if they didn't do what he told them, and he was just an absolute tyrant. Probably the only thing that saved the settlement, they probably would have all just died, if it hadn't have been for a local Indian leader. There's a guy named Powhatan, who's a little bit unusual. I was telling you last time about the Indians of the eastern United States. Generally, we're not Indians with big political structures, with top chiefs or emperors or anything like that. Not like the Aztecs, where you had this huge hierarchy of Aztec rulers. We don't have that in Virginia. It's mostly just little villages that are all sort of self-governing with their own little councils and just people out there, surviving. Powhatan had managed to kind of become somewhat of a powerful leader because he'd managed to gain control over a number of villages. So he did have more power as a ruler than most Indian leaders. Most Indians or leaders were just their little village chief, and just no power outside of their own village. And even that power was very limited by the council of the village. But Powhatan had some power, and for reasons that we do not fully understand, he decided to help these English people, and he provided them with some food, and he provided them with some information on how to growing stuff that would be suitable for the environment. The English brought some seeds over from England that didn't necessarily survive in the Virginia environment, but Powhatan gave them some seeds of stuff that did grow. Is what we would call corn. The English had brought with them what they called wheat, and that didn't do that well in the soil and the climate and so forth of Virginia, much of which, as I said, is not really suitable. It's not an agricultural wonderland, with so much of the land being swampy and everything. But they did get by, and they did survive with the help of Powhatan. As I said, we don't know why he did that. And the problem is that our only source of information about this whole episode is from the diary of John Smith. I mean, there are no other records. The Indians didn't keep any records. They didn't have any writing, so they don't have any written records, and there's no other documentation. And many people have thought that John Smith was a notorious liar and braggart. He talked a lot about himself and how great he was and how powerful he was. He was sort of the center of the whole story. And many people think, he probably made up a lot of that to make himself look good. And so we don't know for sure, but in his account, the story was that the Indians had been about ready to kill him and some of the other English people. And then the daughter of Powhatan, a woman who was about 10 years old, just a little girl, she's 10 years old, she came, and according to Smith, she said, "Oh, daddy, 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 let these white guys live," and that she convinced them to not only to let the English survive, but to help them and provide them with food and other support that they needed. We don't know if that's true or not. Some people think, oh, it's just made up, but we don't know. We've got some other information about John Smith, and we've seen that some of his other things that he bragged about. We have other independent documents, because he went back to Europe and he was involved in other things, where we do have other records of what went on. And some of them makes it seem like, John Smith maybe often was telling the truth about himself and his adventures and his accomplishments. So we don't know. Anyway, whatever the reason, the English depended upon the Indians to help them survive, and it was with Indian help that they made it through, although very high death rate, but the colony was there, it was operating, and it was functioning. But it wasn't making any money. And in fact, the company had to send over more and more supplies to try to keep it alive and keep it going. They had to send over more settlers to try to help out, but they had to pay all their way. The company is putting out a ton of money for transportation costs, for survival costs, for life aboard the boat en route, all of the things that were involved in relocating people to America. The company is spending a lot of money. Money's going out and none is coming in. And so every year the company was going around to the stockholders, hey, you got to put some more money in, you got to add to your investment, and if you want to keep your investment alive, you want to keep your stock in the company valid, you got to pay some more money now. And they'd have an assessment, and people didn't like that, but what are you going to do? And there's no money coming in. In 1612, though, after 5 years, the story changed. And the story changed because of a guy named John Rolfe. John Rolfe, who was a wealthy man in England, one of the investors in the company, and he decided that he was going to go to America. The company is run by directors, it's run by the investors who are all in London. But he decided that he is actually going to go to America itself and see what's going on and see if he could do something to turn this company around. So he went out. On his way to America, he stopped somewhere in the Caribbean. I'm not sure which island he went to, but he stopped at one of the islands of what we call the West Indies, is in the Caribbean. And he picked up there a product that was growing there, was I think native to that island, a plant. And he said, I wonder if this plant could survive in Virginia. So he stopped en route at the island in the Caribbean, and then he picked up this plant and he took it to Virginia. Many of you know what it was. It was tobacco. And it turned out that yes, the Virginia climate and the soil and so forth, which is not that suitable for a lot of agriculture, nevertheless, it would accommodate tobacco. Tobacco doesn't take a lot of land. It's not like a wheat field where you need a big field to grow. You could grow tobacco on a very small little plot of land, just individual plants. People started growing tobacco, and they could take it to Europe, and people hadn't heard of lung cancer at that time, so they could take the tobacco to Europe and they could sell it at a nice profit. So at last, we figured out how to make money in Virginia. And the way we're going to do it is by growing tobacco. Now, some details here though. The King of England, James I, disliked tobacco. People knew about it. He thought it was terrible stuff. He wrote a little pamphlet attacking tobacco. And there's a line in it that says something about why would anyone smoke on the suck on the smoke of a burning weed, you know, that it's a terrible thing. It's called a counterblast to tobacco. So tobacco in England was kind of politically incorrect. If you were anybody who was, you know, wealthy and important, and if you wanted to have any dealing with the king, you better not go in with tobacco on your breath, because that's a no-no for the king. So, all right, so it's not going to be there. The place where you could sell tobacco was, in fact, in the Netherlands, and to the Dutch. In Amsterdam, there were skilled craftsmen who could make cigars. I mean, and that's what people did with the tobacco. They made it into cigars. And the people who did that, cigar makers, were sort of centered in Amsterdam. And from there, they would make cigars and they'd be sold throughout other parts of Europe. And some, of course, made it back to England, but it's a little bit dicey to try to sell tobacco in England because of the king's hostility. But so the tobacco is going to the Netherlands, and there are Dutch masters who make cigars, and they're making money by selling the product, but that's not the company. That's not the Virginia company. So the company is still in trouble. So there's one issue is that because of the king's attitude, tobacco is not really available or is not accepted in England, and that causes an issue, and that means that it's going to go over to the Netherlands. And another issue is that, you know, who's going to be growing the tobacco in Virginia? And the thing that had happened after the company had started was that there were, in Virginia, the land belonged to the company. The charter that the company got from the king gave it this very vast area of land. You know, it ran all the way, as a matter of fact, they didn't know how far this was, but it actually, according to the charter, ran all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So they've got a huge stretch of land across North America. And under the charter, it all belongs to the company. Now, some of you may say, well, wait a minute, who authorized the company to, or the king to give this land to the company? And the answer is, well, he just did. He said, I'm going to grant this land to the company. But what the company had done in a relatively small number of cases was to grant the land to individuals. So there are some, although most of the land belongs to the company, within Virginia, scattered around through the whole settled area, are some individual land owners, people who own their own plot of land. And it's a little bit of a mixed pattern as to how that all happened. It's like almost every single landowner is an individual in a unique case. Sometimes these are people who had known somebody in the company and they asked for, could I have some private land here? Could I have some land of my own? Or the company had rewarded people who had been long service, some of the people who had been in the first settlement and had survived for many years were rewarded by being given some land. Some of it they gave to people as an incentive to persuade them to go to America. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, and it's not clear exactly how all of it happened because there's so many different cases. Every case is almost a different thing. But there are a number of individual landowners in Virginia. And they own their own land, so they started growing tobacco, but they figured out very quickly that they could make more money if they could grow more tobacco. Tobacco is very labor intensive as a product. You have to almost deal with each individual plant by itself, one single plant at a time. And you have to kind of culture it and cultivate it and grow it and nurse it along until you get a whole bunch of them growing, but only as many as you can handle as an individual. And then to harvest it, you just cut off each leaf one at a time, one leaf at a time, and you have to hang it up to dry, and that's called curing. You have to dry it out for a shipment and for eventual manufacture into a cigar somewhere over in the Netherlands. And the people who are growing the tobacco are individuals within the company acting on their own. They're making some money from this by selling the tobacco to the Amsterdam cigar makers, and they're making money, but the company isn't making any money. This is not the company. And as a matter of fact, a lot of these individual landowners started hiring some of their co-workers and the other people who were there supposedly working for the company. I mean, that's what the company sent these guys over there. They were to work for the company. But some of these individual landowners then, offer them a better deal. You come to work for me, help me grow some more tobacco, increase my output. And so, yeah, people are working there. They're working for individuals, and those individuals are making money, but the company is still broke. It's not making any money. So, and the company is just in terrible shape. I mean, by this time we're talking about up to, maybe say, John Rolfe introduced the tobacco in 1612, say 5 years later, 1617. Yeah, now there's quite a bit of tobacco being grown in Virginia. The people who are growing it are selling it and making a lot of money from it, and it's a very successful product. But the company is just in worse shape than ever. And as a matter of fact, the company is all torn apart into factions. There's different groups of investors blaming all the other groups of investors for the problems, and it's a real ugly situation, and everybody's unhappy, and the company is all mad, and they blame the settlers because they say the settlers are not working for them, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be employed by the company, and they're all off working for the private owners and instead of the company. And the people in Virginia say the company is trying to put all these rules on us, and they don't understand our need to export this tobacco to the Netherlands, and everybody's mad at everybody, and it's just a disaster. Now, in 1618, a guy came along in the Virginia company who's another wealthy investor. He's a little different from Rolfe because he never himself came to America, but he's aware of it. He's one of the private investors who's figuring out, and he takes control of the company. He was elected by the other stockholders as his title I think was treasurer, but that he was what we would today call the CEO of this company. And he comes up with a plan, and actually had a number of different ways to try to change the company and make it profitable. He's going to try to turn this into a successful business after more than a decade of failure and loss and disaster. he came up with several ideas, but one of them was to look at this situation where within Virginia there are people who are succeeding because they own their own land. Now this is something that English people can relate to real easily. Within English culture, the definition of freedom for many, many years had meant that you own your own land. And the whole idea was that if you own your own land, you depend on nobody but yourself. You can be self-reliant. And this is a very important thing to understand about English society. English society said people who own their own land have freedom. Most people in England did not. Most people in England are farm workers, either they're tenants or they're laborers or some sort of relationship with somebody who owns land. Most of the land of England is owned by a relatively small number of extremely wealthy big landowners, big huge barons with vast tracts of land and large numbers of people working there for them, but dependent on them for their livelihood, dependent on the landowner for survival. You can't live unless you can find a landowner willing to take you on and let you farm on his land, work for him, give him your produce, but let him give you something that you can survive on. And for most people of England, status is working for somebody else, working on their land. The people who own the land are people who have freedom because they can control their own lives. They don't depend on somebody else. So this idea of freedom is very important to people in England, and it's totally tied up with land ownership. And in fact, the situation that's evolved in Virginia sort of shows that this is the way it is. That the people who somehow have gotten to be landowners, people who are private owners of their own land, are the people who are succeeding. The other people who are working for the company are just slogging along and barely surviving, and nothing is working, and it's not going well at all. So land ownership becomes the key to freedom, to individuality. So this Englishman, whose name was Sir Edwin Sandys, and it looks like it's be pronounced Sandys, but it's pronounced Sands. Sands looks at this situation and says, well, as long as that's the way it is, let's try to take advantage of that. Let's try to turn that to our own advantage. Let's try to have the company benefit from the fact that people want to be landowners. Let's give them land. We've got tons of land. We don't need that land. What we need are people. We need people to settle the land. And we'll give them their land, let them produce whatever they can, and in most cases that's going to be tobacco, not a trick question. Let them grow tobacco. Let them export it and take it to the Dutch, but let the company handle the trade. Instead of trying to make money from people working for us doing what we don't know, and we never could figure out what they were supposed to be doing, let them do whatever they want. Let them own their own land. Let them produce on it. Let them have the freedom to grow whatever they want. And then we'll carry that product to Europe. We'll be the middlemen, and we'll make our profit as middlemen. We'll make a profit by buying products in America, taking it to the Netherlands or wherever we can. Probably the biggest market was the Netherlands, but if we could find tobacco makers, cigar makers anywhere else, we'll take it to them. And we'll sell it to them, and we'll sell it at a profit, and that's where we'll make our money. That's what most of us do anyway. We're merchants, we're middlemen. That's how we became wealthy. We were people who were engaged in trade, and so we'll just keep doing that. That's what we do, that's what we know. And as merchants, we'll make middlemen's profits. And the more people we have in Virginia growing stuff, the more money we'll make. So, and we won't try to send people to America. The company's going broke trying to send more settlers. It's keeping more settlers going over to Virginia and spending money on their transportation, their supplies, and so forth. Let's let people go on their own. So Sands came up with a system called head right. 2 words, head right. And the derivation of that term is that for each head that you transported to America, yourself or as anybody else that goes with you, for each head you will have a right to 50 acres of land. You can get 50 acres of land per person, per head, but the catch is you have to transport them to America. You have to make all the arrangements. You're on your own. You don't go through the company. You contract with a ship to carry yourself to America. You take care of that yourself. And you take care of all the supplies you'll need on the boat and to get started in producing in Virginia. And all of that is going to be at your expense. But if you'll do it, you'll get 50 acres for yourself. If you happen to have a wife and say 2 kids, that's 4 people, you'll get 200 acres of land. And I don't know if many of you have a sense for what an acre is. Most of you are not farmers. I'm not, but frankly, 200 acres was more land than you could possibly use. I mean, you'd have land for many, many generations with 200 acres if you started that. Especially growing tobacco, which doesn't require very large farms. You can grow it you can make enough money by producing tobacco on a relatively small plot of land. If you just grow it, have all of these leaves of tobacco that you can, from different plants. So the head right system offered people the chance to become landowners in Virginia. But it represents a big change in the way that England is going about settling America. Remember, the idea had been at the beginning that America is going to be a refuge for the homeless. It's going to be a place where people can go who are poor, homeless, unemployed, desperate in England, and then you go over and you work for the company and you get out of England and you help solve the homeless problem. Well, the appeal of the original plan had been to use homeless people to settle America. Well, now it's going to be people who are going to be able to pay for their own passage, which means, by definition, these are people who have to have some money to start out with. Yeah, the head right deal is a great deal. It's a great offer. 50 acres of land per person is, as I said, a lot more than you could ever use in England. And you won't never get that much land in England. But you've got to have some assets to get to America. You can't just be a poor person because you have no way to take advantage of it. So who is going to go? Well, the answer is that England does have a small, what we would call a middle class. Most people in England are very poor. They have no assets. They work for somebody else. They're totally dependent on a big landowner. And then there's the few wealthy landowners who own these big, huge estates and have everybody else working for them. But England did have sort of a middle class of small landowners, small farm landowners. England had a group of people that were self-employed. They owned their own farms. They raised stuff on it with just their own labor and that of their families. We would call them family farms. And there were, within England, we don't know how many of the English population fell into this, but it's a relatively small group of people in England, but it's there. There are these middle-class people, we would call them, what, family farmers, who were in a position where they could sell their land in England. They could sell it to one of the big barons, one of the big wealthy landowners who are always looking to acquire more land. They could sell their farm, get enough money to pay for their passage, to pay for the costs of survival in America for a year or two or whatever, and still have some money left over, but get a lot more land in America than they owned in England. So there's this middle class that is now going to become the basis of English settlement in America. The idea of using America as a refuge for the homeless of England, as sort of a solution to the problem of homelessness, that idea seems to have gotten shoved aside. Instead, America is a place where the English middle class could move to America and become middle class farmers in America, relocate a middle class civilization of England to America. And America is going to become a land of middle class farmers, of family farmers. And that was the basis of settlement in Virginia. It became the basis of settlement of all other colonies. The details are very different. The specifics change a lot. If we had a little bit more time, we could look at many other colonies and look at the details. And some of them are unique. Other colonies used the headright system. Others did not. But the principle for all English colonies in North America was that middle-class people in England are going to somehow liquidate their assets in England, get their wealth, use their money to transport themselves to America, and reestablish a middle-class civilization in America based on family farms and based on individual freedom. America became a land of freedom defined as owning your own land. So this is going to be successful. It's going to work for all colonies. Eventually 13 colonies were established, all based on that basic principle. The details are quite different, and if you got into the specifics, you'd have to make all sort of modifications and specifications and amendments, but keeping it general, that's what English settlement was about. It's about a middle class in England, which is a small part of English society, but they are the middle class of England. They go to America and they become middle class farmers in America, and basically America was a civilization of middle class family farmers. let's get back to where we started. What does this mean about the Indians? What's the happening to the Indians? And the answer is, they are supposed to go away. The whole English settlement is not based on Indians, as were the Spanish and the French. It's almost the opposite. It's based on getting rid of the Indians, because it's based on taking land. We want land. And the people who have the land are the Indians. Well, goodbye. There's no place for Indians in this middle class, small family farmer society. So the Indians are just expected to leave. And there are various ways to convince them of that. Sometimes the English would make an effort to be fair, and they would try to buy the land from Indians, and they would try to treat them fairly and say, well, it's their property, they're entitled to it, and so we have to pay them for it. Some Englishmen were honest about that. But even the people who were honest, and I'll mention some of their names later, even the people who said we have to treat Indians fairly, bottom line was, Indians leave. I mean, maybe they leave happy, and they leave with some money in their pockets, but they still leave. Other times, it was more forceful. Bottom line is, if the Indians just say, wait a minute, we don't want to leave, then it's time to get the guns out and tell them, you've got to leave. The Indians just don't fit into English society. Indians are crucial to French and Spanish society. They have no role to play in English society. Their only role is to give the land to English people who can come over and settle it in order to establish their demand for freedom. English freedom depends on Indians leaving and giving up their land. So, if you call this a racist sentiment, yes, America was based on racism. Anglo-America was based on a society, an idea that, well, there are white people who've come over and said, we want this land, and so you have to go, because we want it. And the reason is, we want it. To justify that, the English, and actually the Spanish and the French did some of this too, but they developed an idea that, well, the English looked at the Indians and said, you guys don't have individual land ownership. You don't have our definition of freedom as depending on owning your own land. That's not the basis of English civilization. I mean, it's not the basis of Indian civilization. It's the basis of English civilization. It's not relevant to the Indian society. I didn't really maybe talk too much about this in the class, but I know there were some questions on the quiz about how Indian society revolved more upon a community. It revolved more around people feeling that they were part of a community. It includes other people. It includes the natural environment. We have to live in it. We work with it. We're part of it. We all have to kind of be a communal society. We have to take care of each other. We're in a community organization here. It's a little hard to call it a tribe, but it's a village or whatever. It's some sort of a community, and we're all in it together. And your responsibility is to make sure that you are a fit, proper member of your community. And there's no such thing as private ownership of land. People own resources. I mean, you know, the people that I know, the Indians that I probably know a lot about are from my hometown, of my home state of Montana, were the Blackfeet, where their culture revolved very much around hunting buffalo, and that meant that the key to success was to have good horses, so you could go out and ride and kill a whole bunch of buffalo. And so people had horses, which were crucial to their way of life, and each person owned their own horses. But the idea was that you sort of owned them for the community in mind. And for people who owned a bunch of horses, there were individuals in the Blackfeet community who owned large numbers of horses, but they were expected to let other people use their horses. The whole system was that, yeah, maybe these are my horses, and that I'm responsible for kind of caring for them, and I have a place to keep them, and I breed them, and so forth and so forth. But it's for the benefit of others, and if there's somebody out there who doesn't have any horses, he's used mine, because that's part of it. We're all in this together, and I have a responsibility to make sure that everybody has a good horse to go out, so that they can all go out and hunt buffalo and survive. So the English come in, and they take over, and they dispose the Indians, and they establish this culture. And their argument is, because the Indians don't have private ownership of land, they don't deserve it. It's not really theirs. They don't have any private ownership. They don't even care about private ownership. So they don't deserve it. So that makes it okay for us to take the land and kick them out, since they don't deserve it anyway. They don't really own it because they don't have private ownership. So it's okay. And on that basis, Virginia eventually, the company went away. The company didn't profit from any of this, and the company was eliminated in 1624. They finally took away its charter because it was a failure. So the company failed, but Virginia succeeded as a colony, and other colonies, although the details are all different, other colonies also survived on the same basic principle. America is a land of freedom, a land of middle-class farmers.